Not my story, but my dad's. Around 40 years ago, when my dad was still in college, he moved quite a ways from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam to New Haven, Connecticut for college. He wanted to be near as possible to his college, but also wanted to overlook the city skyline. He had already received the Form I-20 and went to the consular at the U.S. Embassy to try to get an M student visa. He was a first-generation immigrant, and though he had taken a fair amount of English classes in Vietnam, he wasn't fluent and knew nothing about housing in America. This is why he went the cheap route and rented out a podunk. Don't know if that's the right word to use, but I mean, it was really shady looking. Apartment somewhere near Pine Tree Drive in West Haven. His landlord, as he told me later, gave off some serious red flags that he sort of brushed off because the apartment was only $250 a month. Firstly, the landlord's abode was directly next door to that of my dad's, and during his first night there, while he was getting unpacked, he heard a high-pitched screeching and weird opera music. Again, he brushed it off for the same reason as said above, and also because he was very tired. The next morning when he awoke, he noticed a chair by his bed that wasn't there before, and when he went to the bathroom, his toilet seat was up, though he recalled putting it down. Not only that, but his door was unlocked. He again brushed it off because he didn't want to stir up anything with his landlord by asking if he had come into his room, or by asking if it had been broken into, therein referring that the apartment was insecure. He also wanted to explore West Haven, as his college year did not begin until late August. He had come 3 weeks early. As he left, he specifically remembered locking his door behind him, but when he returned after a few hours out, he noticed that not only had the door been unlocked, but was slightly ajar. This went on for weeks until his college year began. Things slightly moved from where he had left them, articles of food missing from his fridge, and other weird happenings. Finally, my dad had had enough. One night, he decided to stay awake until very late and try to catch whoever was doing this, red-handed. That night, he finished his homework and then got to bed, but he remained awake, and sure enough, at around 2 in the morning, he sees his door handle turning and a hand sliding through. My dad froze. His blood ran cold. He then saw the landlord creep in and take some eggs from the fridge. Not only that, but the landlord then went to the bathroom, coming out a couple minutes afterwards. He then slipped out once again, leaving the door unlocked. This creeped my dad out like hell, which is understandable, but for some stupid reason, he still decided to stay at the apartment for a few more nights before he finally confronted the landlord. Money and wanting to save it does some stupid things to the brain, I guess. This was before mobile phones and even decent cameras that didn't cost $100+. And so my dad had literally no way to get evidence to show the cops besides mere accusations. The next night, he once more heard the odd screeching and weird opera music coming from his landlord's room, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. That weekend, when his landlord went out shopping, he broke into his landlord's room, and what he found was seriously effing disturbing. First of all, he found some weird sex doll, but when he investigated further, he found an old Kodak camera. Under this was some extremely low-quality pictures of him in bed sleeping. He noped the F out of there, taking the pictures with him, and went to the police station. He moved out of there shortly, and he later heard that this same landlord had scared other residents of the apartment off after hearing the odd screeching and opera music, and after seeing all of their things moved around. The building my dad lived in was since torn down, and my dad decided to just dorm at Sigma Chi. He at first opted to stay away from fraternities because of the heavy partying. We never knew what happened to the landlord, only that he would be facing some prison time. I seriously hope he was never allowed to be a landlord again. I was on a plane once and noticed that, although people were still boarding, there was a large number of seats around me unoccupied. The last people on, though, were all together and consisted of one large family traveling together. There were 4 adults and about 10 children, ranging from toddler age to high school, young adult. They had the usual look of a large group traveling with children, some of whom were shy and withdrawn, others who were running around, and the adults looking frazzled, trying to keep everyone and everything together. When they'd all been seated, there seemed to be some issue with the seating, as one member of their party was supposed to sit several rows back. The flight attendant apologized and said that it happens, that sometimes their computer will shuffle sequential seating, etc., but assured them that there was seating available for everyone. The family sat down, -1, and started with the usual, "That's a shame, wish they could sit up here," talk. Since it seemed that their party were surrounding me, I stopped the flight attendant and asked her if I could switch seats with another passenger. This caught the attention of the large group, perhaps anticipating a complaint, but the flight attendant told me no, they don't usually do that, and that everyone has been seated, but asked if there was a problem with where I was sitting. I explained to her that I was traveling solo and did not care where I sat, and asked if I could give my seat to the member of the family who was absent, as my seat would put them in the midst of their group. The family overheard and was thanking me as I retrieved my bag overhead and followed the flight attendant to the family member's seat. She explained what was happening, and I noticed that the family member, a young girl, maybe 12 years old, seemed in a hurry to get back to her family and thanked me 4 times. She practically ran up the aisle, and before I could sit down, the man who had been sitting next to her was literally staring with his mouth open and asked,
"What's the problem?" "No, that girl was sitting here first."
Red flag number 1. And the flight attendant explained to him what was happening, and he immediately looked at me and said,
"No, I don't want to sit next to him. Where's that girl going?"
She explained to him that there was no issue and nothing she could do now. I think she was getting the same vibe. Now, I want to assure everybody that I'm not in the habit of judging people by their appearance, but this guy was the definition of red flags. He was overweight and paunchy, that overweight with no muscle tone look some people have. Half bald, with a few strands combed over, thick glasses, and no chin. He was a mouth breather and kept his mouth open constantly, drooling on himself and then sucking it back in between heavy breathing. If there were a textbook example of a creep, it would be him. As I was putting my bag overhead, he started talking to himself under his breath about how this was BS, just my luck, wasn't bothering anybody, and why did they move that girl? I wanted to say something to him, but I didn't. It wasn't long before my neighbor got a call and was talking about an upcoming court appearance, and I overheard no victims testimony, and rarely show up, and people wouldn't ask me to babysit if I was like that. The only time I said almost anything to him was when he started blatantly watching porn on his laptop with earphones in, grunting, sweating, wheezing, and kept repeating, "Little bitch," when a part was on he evidently liked. Then took a blanket and covered his lap, his hands fidgeting underneath it. As soon as I saw he intended on keeping them there, I pretended to reach for the call button. Then he jerked his hands out and started muttering under his breath about me minding my own business. At some point, I got up to use the restroom, and when I returned, he was on the phone again, and I caught something about the ass on her. No, switch seats on me. Got away, haha. And he shut up as he saw me approaching. The creep went to sleep eventually, and fortunately stayed asleep the rest of the flight. When we were all deboarding, a woman I presumed was the mother was standing with the girl and said thank you again. I shudder to think how he acted in the short amount of time she was next to him, or how he would have if she had remained there. Shocking absolutely no one, including himself, he was met at the gate by security and police, and as he was being led away, he said,
"This isn't my laptop, by the way."
This happened almost a decade ago when I was 13 years old. I remember my friend and I were excited about our first time trick-or-treating without our parents. We lived in a small town where nothing ever happens, and we thought it would be the same that night. It started like any other Halloween night. We collected our candy, ran into many of our classmates, and had a lot of fun. At 8 p.m., we realized that we had to head home, but on the way back, we dropped by our teacher's house. She wasn't home, and the streets didn't have many streetlights. To add to this, most of the houses had their lights turned off, and their Halloween decorations were taken down. My friend and I were slightly spooked and disappointed by the lack of candy. We wanted to get out of the street as soon as possible. That's when a man emerged from under one of the few streetlights. It was a police officer. Neither of us seemed to notice him before this, possibly due to the darkness. He startled us, but seemed very friendly. The cop introduced himself and pointed to an inconspicuous bungalow. He said an older man living in this house was inviting trick-or-treaters inside. Someone called the police, but when he arrived, no one was answering the door. He kept telling us his police car and partner were just around the block. We looked around, but couldn't see them. I was a pretty paranoid kid. Growing up, my mom loved watching crime shows, and she'd always tell me tidbits of lessons. One of these was a story about fake cops. Although I don't remember the details, I remembered people can pretend to be police officers to gain trust. Throughout this whole exchange, I was terrified. His lack of badge, police car, and partner did not feel right. I was also conflicted because he was smiling and seemed like he just wanted to help. That was until we heard his strange request. He said he needed to speak to this potential predator and needed our help. Since we were young girls, the man would answer if we knocked. The officer claimed that he would hide behind the bushes next to the front door. He would wait for him to invite us in, jump out, and catch him red-handed. At that moment, I knew my friend felt the same way I did. We both fell silent, but one of us managed to ask if we could discuss. The cop said yes, but told us we had limited time. The street was silent and he could hear everything. I remember the feeling of wanting to say something, but fearing that he would hear us and escalate the situation. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. The cop was getting increasingly impatient and told us that we had to decide quickly. Around that moment, a family came down the street and noticed the officer. They were coming over to see what was happening. That's when the cop said he'd be right back and to not go anywhere. My friend and I scrambled to collect our thoughts and decided to run away. We sprinted out of the street and didn't look back. On our way home, we discussed theories that range from him being a fake cop, him playing a prank on us, or him being a real cop, but we misunderstood the situation. When we told our parents, we downplayed it a lot and doubted our experience. In the end, we didn't call the police, but our dads drove to the house and area around the house. No cop cars or police officers were in sight. Over the years, I can say that I regret not calling the police. At the time, my friend and I were convinced we misunderstood what happened. We even told our class the next day, and most, including our teacher, thought it was not alarming. Looking back, I find it extremely strange a police officer would put two children in such a potentially dangerous situation. Moreover, with our parents not present. I wonder what his motives were, but it will, unfortunately, remain unsolved.